Okay, so we're back. It's part 2 of lesson 4. We're working with Android intents today. So we've done kind of our most basic example where we've just used an explicit intent to invoke another class within our project. And we've used reflection to access the runtime version of our detail activity and the underlying Java class to start the activity. So now we're going to try using an extra. So what we want to do is we're going to keep this intent, but we're also going to add an extra that gets passed from our main activity to the detail activity. So I'm going to go back to the designer in my main activity. So I'm going to add a text view here. So I'm going to click on text in my palette. I'm going to add a plain text object. So I'm going to anchor it above my details button. So I will anchor our text view above the details button, and I'll give it an ID of name edit text. I'm going to take out the name attribute. We don't want any text to appear in here, but we'll add a hint using a string resource that will prompt. So there'll be a prompt in here that will disappear as soon as the user puts their cursor in, asking them to enter their name. So I'll scroll down in my list of attributes. I'll click the little square here that says pick a resource. I'll make a new resource. Oops, hang on. Maybe I picked the wrong thing. I don't want, I clicked on height. So I want a string value. If the second layout, well, the layout, if you created the activity, Misam, there should automatically be 2 files. When you create a new activity, Android Studio creates both the XML resource file and the k.kt file. If you created a resource file only without the activity, then you have to go back and create a new activity, because we need a .kt file so we can read the extra and display it. I'll show you that in a minute. Okay, so my resource name will be enter name, and my value will say enter your name. So this will be the hint or the placeholder in my edit text. Again, you can put in any resource names and values that you want here. They don't have to match mine. And I'll say okay. So I'm going to open up my project view. So it's possible, Misam, you may have done this. You may have just chosen new Android resource file. We actually need to create a new activity, an empty activity. If you choose a resource file, that creates the XML file, but it's just an XML document. There's no Kotlin file attached. There's no class generated. So to make sure you get both files, you need to click new and choose activity and empty activity. That will add the XML file under resource layout, and it adds the Kotlin file under Java and the name of your project. Well, you're talking about in your assignment, I think, correct? We're not talking about, okay. Now probably, I can't really go into that right now. Happy to talk about that with you, but maybe we'll talk about that outside of class. Feel free to book an office hours appointment. Okay. Because we've got 39 different assignments, so I can't go into the specifics of each one during class, obviously. Fair question. Happy to talk to you about it. but we'll maybe do that offline. Okay, so now I've got my edit text above my button. Again, I can dump the so here's the code, the XML rendering of my main activity if you need it. So I'm going to go back to my main activity, and now after we create the intent, but before we invoke the intent, we want to use an extra to pass some data along. So I'll create a variable here to pass the text entered in the text view So we're going to use our intent, and we're going to call the put extra method. And there's a number of different signatures here. So I'm going to call my extra name, and we'll read it from our name edit text. .text. Now, this returns a value, a data type of type editable. So we need to convert that to a string. So this is going to allow us to capture the value of the edit text, store it in an extra called name, and then this extra is bundled in our intent. Yep, I will come back to that. So now on our detail view, we want to be able to read this extra and display it. Okay. So I've added this line to my on-click listener after we create the intent, but before we call start activity. Okay, so Edwin, so if this is empty, for example, we don't want to start the activity. Is that what you're thinking? Sure. Okay. Yeah, let's do that. So we can just wrap this in an if statement. That's a good idea. So if. So let's move all of this in here. So we're not going to load the details activity if there's no value. A few different ways we could do it. So we could call the is not empty. We'll try this. So if we convert that value and it's not empty, then we'll load the new intent. We'll try that. Good suggestion, Edwin. We have to tweak this if statement a bit. So I'm going to load the activity. I'm going to try to click the details button first without putting any text in the text box, in the text view. Then I'll add something in there and try it again. Okay, so if I click details, nothing happens. As soon as I put one character in, it loads. Thanks for the suggestion. That's a good idea. So we can use this is not empty to check. Maybe make a comment in here. Only invoke intent if the edit text has a value entered. So now on our detail activity, we want to read the extra and display it. Sure, Andrew, I guess we could do that as well. Why not? Let's add. We could add a toast message, for example. So we use generally our context, which is this. Please enter your name. So we'll show an error message. Really like the suggestions. Thank you. Your suggestions are making our little app better. We'll try this. And again, I'll dump all the code into the chat in a minute. I'll just apply the changes. We didn't add any new resources to the app, so I can just apply the changes. So if I try and submit it empty, I get a little toast message and it stays on our main activity. As soon as I enter something, it'll load our details activity. So good suggestions, guys. Thanks for those. So I'll add this whole event handler that includes kind of our validation. So now I want to go to the detail activity and I want to add another text view where we can read this extra and display it on the next activity. Okay. Any other questions about this activity so far? Hayden, I'm going to finish this and then I will come back to your question because I think it is a good one and I do want to address it. Okay, so let's go to the detail activity. I'm going to go to the XML first. I'm going to add a second text view underneath the first one. So I'm going to click on text view, add another text view. I'll give it an ID of we'll call it message text view. I want it to go underneath our detail activity. This underneath the text view we've already got. A little hard to, well, I guess I could try and blow it up. Let's see, I'll zoom in a bit. So if I go from the top, I don't know this is going to work, to the bottom. Yeah, that works. A little tricky. And I'll align it horizontally. So there's my text view. I'm going to just wipe out the text property here. By default, our text view can be empty. So we don't actually even see it right now. So I've added a message text view underneath our heading text view. Here's the XML definition of the layout. Whoops. Sorry, that. Okay. So now in our detail activity, when our activity is created, we want to read the name key from the extras object and display in our second text view. So we don't even need to declare an intent. The intent is built in. It's the intent that was used to load this activity. And we'll call getStringExtra. And we pass in the key. So in this case, our main activity, we're creating an extra called name, all lowercase. So we're reading that value and placing it in a local variable. And then we'll set the text property of our message text. So we'll append this. That's just a warning. I think I'll leave it. Okay, well, it's asking me to just inject it this way. Okay, that's fine. So let's try this out. So we're creating the extra before starting the intent on our main activity, and then in our detail, we're reading the extra from the intent, from the inbound intent, and then displaying it. So we'll try that change. I've added a new view, a new text view to the detail activity, so I've got to restart the app. I can't just apply the changes. I noticed yesterday my emulator sometimes was buggy. I would run my activity. It says it's installed, but it isn't loading. So I may need to try this again. Okay, so enter my name. So the extra will pass that value. Fairly simple, almost like in web programming. You think all the way back to a language like PHP, how we're using a session variable. We can write value to the session, and then on another page, we can read it out of the session based on the key. So the extras work pretty similarly. So chances are, depending on your assignment, you'll need to use extras as users navigate from activity to activity, and there are certain values that you want to pass. So we've used one extra here called name. We're not limited. So if you have a series of extras, we can just have a series of put extras. There's also another way of doing it with an object called a bundle. You can read about that syntax in the Android docs, but it basically works the same way. So the syntax of using the bundle is a little different, but we're basically just using put extra to write and get string extra or get int extra, get date extra, whatever type it is. Okay, Hayden, I do want to come to your question. So you talked about the intent filters. So the easiest way for us to look at that maybe is let's take a look at the official docs actually describe the intent filters fairly well. So let's maybe have a look at this for a minute. Okay, so we can kind of see what it does. So here's our syntax. We can have an icon, a label, we can prioritize them. So it basically talks about what kind of intents. Oh, sorry, thank you. I meant to put that in the chat. Thank you. So what kinds of intents an activity can respond to? Okay, so it basically declares sort of what can the parent do, okay, and what kind of broadcast can it receive, okay. So there's a good description in here of the various attributes. Yeah, so you can feel free, you can play around with some of these, and they've got a kind of a link to a more descriptive version of this here. Okay. So, I mean, this is basically what we've done, was just use an implicit intent to navigate between activities. So kind of a more detailed description is here. Yeah, we're going to play around with this a little bit more as well. So we've kind of worked with the explicit intent, how we can move from one activity for another. So for today, I've just used buttons, or we've just used a button to navigate. We will look at actually using a navigation bar in a few weeks, because we may want navigation at the top or at the bottom of our app. But in any case, we'll still use intents on those to navigate around through our app. And we can use those extras for passing data along with those intents. So that's using an explicit intent. I also want to try invoking one and maybe even two implicit intents today. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the app, and let's see, let's add, I guess we've got room on our detail activity because everything's up at the top. So I'm going to go back into my detail activity, and I'm going to enter an edit text underneath our plain text. So I'm going to click on text view. Whoops, sorry, which one do I want? Let's see if it's here. So we actually want an edit text. Okay. Sorry, whoops, there's my manifest. I clicked the wrong item, I'm sorry. I'll just undo that. Let me do that again. Go back to my designer. I want a plain text. I'm going to call it URL edit text. Okay. I'll align it right and left, and I'm going to put it below our message edit text. It's kind of hard to do this in the visual designer because they're overlapping. So I'm going to go into the code window to set that. Okay, so here's my edit text, and I will set the top to the bottom of our message text view. And for this one, I'm going to make the width match the parent. I'm going to take out the text property, and I'm actually going to change that to the hint property, and I'll create a new string called enter URL. which Android Studio doesn't recognize that resource, so it's going to prompt me to create it. So I'm going to create a string value resource. It says enter a URL to load. Okay, so here's my edit text. I've put the XML representation for that in the chat. So it'll appear underneath. I could probably add some padding to this, but I'm not going to worry about it for right now. And then I want a button underneath it that we can enter a URL, click a button, and then it's going to use an implicit intent to launch a browser and open whatever URL is typed. So I'm going to add a button. I'll give it an ID of the browse button. And I'm going to put it underneath I'll create another string resource to set the text of my button. And where you place these things on your form, it's not really important. We're more interested in the functionality. I'll create a new string value. We'll call the resource browse to, and our button will say browse to. You can put anything you want on the button. The UI piece of it isn't really too important. We're more interested in using the intent. Okay, so now I've got a button that says browse to. So when we click this button, if there's a URL entered in our edit text, we want to use an implicit intent to invoke a browser on our device and load, not only invoke the browser, but load that particular URL. Okay, I'll just run my app to look at the UI. I'll put the browse button you need in the chat as well. Okay, so it's got my welcome message with my extra, and now it's asking for a URL. Right now, clicking the button doesn't do anything. It's okay, we're going to write our click handler, and we're going to use an implicit intent this time. So we're actually going to go outside of our app. The browser is considered a normal, under normal protection, so we don't need to declare an explicit permission for our app to invoke our browser. So in my detail activity, we're going to set an on-click listener where if we have a value in our edit text, we're going to use that to try and open the browser. So we'll check our URL. So if it's not empty, we'll read the text property and we'll convert it to a string. So we'll create an intent. And this time, we're going to say what kind of intent we're going to use. So if I hit intent dot, you can actually see all of the different actions we can invoke. These are all enumerators in Android. So we can make phone calls, we can access the camera, we can create a document. There's lots here. So the action that we want here, and a lot of these will require permissions because they're considered dangerous permissions. I think as Landon was asking earlier. But the permission we want is just action view. Okay, so we want an intent that's going to view, yes. And we're going to add some data to our intent. And which is we're going to parse our URL as a URI, a universal resource indicator. We've got to make an import to this class. So this adds android.net.uri. We're going to add data to the intent. And then we want to launch the intent. And again, even though we're not actually opening an activity in the app, we're calling a different app on the device, we still just use the method start activity. So start activity is used for both implicit and explicit intents. We don't have different methods. Now I haven't validated that the text entered is actually a properly formatted URL. Could use a regular expression for that. I'm going to leave that out for now. Okay. So let's run this and try it out. We'll see what happens. This should use the default browser on our emulator, or if you're connected to a physical device, it should use the default browser to load your URL. Let's try it out. I'll dump the code in the chat. Let's see how this works. It says my app was installed, but it's not loading, so I'm going to run it again. It's going to enter some text and go to the details, and now I will put in a URL. And we'll see if I can browse to it with my intent. So there's a slight delay. It opens up my browser and takes the data as well to load the URL we want. Yeah, pretty simple, right? Just a few lines of code to be able to invoke. Yeah. Okay, so there's our there's our implicit intent. I'm in Chrome, but I didn't say use Chrome in this case. It just uses the default browser on the device. So if I install Firefox on my emulator, set it as the default browser, it would load a URL that way. Are there any questions about what we did with the implicit intent and how this works? I know many of you will need to use implicit intents in your assignments because you want to use other apps on the device, which is great. So you'll have to check the name of the action you need, and then you'll have to check in the document whether those other apps require explicit permissions or not. We'll look at doing that a little later. We will use the camera and the maps application, but a little bit later in the semester. We'll look at using some more of the features of the device and some of the hardware, in addition to just the software. You can use fragments. So fragment is basically like an Android version of a partial. So it's a component. So yes, you could do that and then embed it. So you have to investigate fragments. That's how you would do it. Okay, so at this point it's 10-1. So I'm going to give you a choice. I'm going to stop the recording in a minute. I'm going to give you another task, another challenge you can do, and I'm going to put you in small breakout groups of maybe 5 for anyone who wants to stick around and try this. So I will stay in the room for a while. If you want to stick around, what I'm going to ask you to do is to create, is to see if you can figure out how to use an implicit intent to send a text message. So you're free to go if you want for today. I will stop the recording. I will record again the solution today. So if you want to stick around, I'm going to take a quick break, but I'm going to come back in at 1 o'clock, and I'll maybe give you 10 or 15 minutes if you want to stick around. It's not a lab. It's not for marks, but it's for practice, okay, where you're working together in small groups. So what I'm going to ask you to do, and I'll put the instructions up, is to see if you can figure out when I put you in a small group, how do we take a phone number that's entered in an edit text and then use it to send a text message. Okay. So I'll lay out the requirements in a minute, and I will assign breakout groups, and then I'll give you about 15 minutes in your breakout group, and we'll maybe come back at around 1:15 and see if any group has been able to come up with a solution. We can share it. Okay, so I'm going to take a pause, go for a quick break, and we'll do that when we come back. Yep, I will post the instructions, absolutely. I'll do that right now.